All right, so move on to the next segment. I'll be sharing my list of my favorite UFC performances in UFC history. So this is my personal list of my favorite performances in UFC history. I do have a total of 4 fights and 4 performances that are going to make my all-time list in terms of favorite performances in UFC history. So let's start off with fight number one. Fight number one is one of my favorite performances in UFC history, and that was Nate Diaz versus Conor McGregor at UFC 196. Now, this is one of my favorite performances from Nate Diaz as a whole. Nate Diaz in this fight against Conor McGregor, the first one at UFC 196. Nate Diaz showed grit, determination to pull off this victory against Conor McGregor, because Conor McGregor was gashing Nate Diaz pillar to post in the octagon for the first 7 minutes of that fight. I mean, Nate Diaz had no answer for Conor McGregor, and his significant strikes that Conor McGregor was landing, several combinations that were hitting home to Nate Diaz. But Nate Diaz just always had that good chin. And Nate Diaz was gushing like a stuffed pig, like the WWE commentators used to say. But the fact that Nate Diaz was bleeding, he didn't panic. He stayed 10 toes down and fought back against Conor McGregor, landing his own significant strikes, letting his hands fly in that octagon, hurting Conor McGregor, stunning him, and then eventually getting the fight to the ground, grappling him down, getting on top of him, hammering down strikes, significant strikes on him, and then locking in that bulldog choke to get the submission victory against Conor McGregor in the second round in the main event at UFC 196. It's very unfortunate we never got a trilogy between Nate Diaz and Conor McGregor, because I think that's something that the UFC would have loved to see, with both being in the prime of their careers, if we could have got it. But that performance by Nate Diaz will always be one of my favorite performances in UFC history. Now, the next fight on my list, man, oh man, it was Francis Ngannou defeating Stipe by knockout at UFC, in the main event of UFC 260, to become the new heavyweight champion in the UFC back in 2021. Now, Francis Ngannou avenged his loss against Stipe when the two respective heavyweight fighters fought in the past. It was Stipe that got the better of Francis Ngannou when he won their first fight by decision. Francis Ngannou avenged his loss, put belt to ass on Stipe, pillar to post ass whooping, pure domination in the second time these two respective heavyweights fought. I mean, Stipe looked like he saw a ghost. He was very confused, very off by the onslaught that Francis Ngannou was giving him offensively. Francis Ngannou was letting his strong, ferocious hands go in that octagon. He even showed some displays of grappling against Stipe. But man, Francis Ngannou, he was hungry for a win that night. Pure domination, and showed why he is one of the baddest heavyweights in MMA still to this day, I believe. And he could prove it when he returns to the PFL in the next few weeks and the next few months. But man, that performance against Stipe, man, that was a pure great performance by Francis Ngannou. Now, next on my list is Holly Holm defeating Ronda Rousey by knockout in the main event of UFC 193. Now, we saw back in 2015 Ronda Rousey take her first UFC loss when Holly Holm, she came, she saw, she conquered the baddest woman on the planet at the time in Ronda Rousey. Holly Holm shocked the whole entire world when she knocked out Ronda Rousey in the second round in the main event of UFC 193 with the roundhouse kick that was heard around the world. And Holly Holm just, oh my goodness, that roundhouse kick put Ronda Rousey to sleep. She was asleep in midair before her head hit the canvas. But that was the downfall of Ronda Rousey. The reason why she lost the second time against Amanda Nunes and then went on to WWE. Her downfall in the UFC started because of Holly Holm. That has to be a masterclass performance by Holly Holm. Nobody seen it coming. True underdog. Nobody believed in her. And she was able to dethrone the baddest woman on the planet in Ronda Rousey. That has to make my list. Now, last but not least, oh man, this performance that Max Holloway had against Brian Ortega in the main event at UFC 231 a few years ago, when Max Holloway was at the top of the mountain at the featherweight division, the reigning defending featherweight champion, one of the greatest featherweight champions in UFC history, with the likes of Alexander Volkanovski, and the fact that Max Holloway gave Brian Ortega his welcoming to the bright lights of being what it's like to be in the main event of a UFC event. Max Holloway not only gave Brian Ortega his first loss, but the fact that it was a belt to ass treatment. Max Holloway was letting his hands fly. Show why he is one of the best strikers in the UFC. Brian Ortega had no answer for him, and Max Holloway was sitting there telling him about his flaws to his face in that octagon for that 5-round championship fight. It was a masterclass performance by Max Holloway. Brian Ortega was bleeding, gushing blood, and Brian Ortega was forced to basically quit on the stool heading into the 5th and final round of that 5 championship fight. The doctor stepped in. Brian Ortega could not go. He was bleeding. He was a bloody crimson mask. He had a black eye. The bottom of his eyelid was basically shut. His eyes was basically shut, swollen. Bottom part of his eyes was purple. Man, Max Holloway was a proud man that night. It gave Brian Ortega his first MMA loss. Those are my 4 favorite UFC performances in UFC history. I'm getting goosebumps even thinking about those 4 respective fighters, how they picked up those victories, and why it sits home to me of my favorite UFC performances in UFC history.